Good morning, everybody. We're going to be getting started in just about a minute. Thank you for being with us. Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Abe Bonowitz. I'm the Executive Director of Death Penalty Action, and welcome to our press conference today to talk about the gas chamber in Alabama. I want to let our audience, we've invited our members to participate and to be present. However, we've disabled the chat. We're going to be focused on the speakers here. And for anybody with the media, just raise your hand, or you can send a chat to the panel. And of course, we'll be able to take your questions that way. And we'll be happy to take your questions after our initial statements. I want to thank everybody for attending. My name is Abraham Bonowitz. That's Abraham. Bonowitz, B as in boy, O, N as in Nancy, O-W-I-T-Z. I am the Executive Director of Death Penalty Action, a national organization that works to shine a spotlight on executions and all the problems with them, and to give people and empower people with the tools to say no to the death penalty and no to executions. I'm also the co-founder of L'Chaim, Jews Against the Death Penalty. And I want to share with you the petition that we have, that you have a link to in your chat. Just get that in front of me here. There we are. So you've got a link to this in the chat and in the press. There we are. And you can see, if you look at this in particular, there is a section here from the Jewish community opposing the gas chamber. Now, we know that what's going on in Alabama is not the Holocaust, and it's not mass executions, but there is particular sensitivity to this for Jews. And we want to highlight that. We want to make sure that people understand that, the gas chamber was really put to use by the Nazis. There is in Arizona a gas chamber that uses Zyklon B, the same cyanide poison that was used to execute millions of people in the Holocaust. But also lethal injection was invented by the personal physician of Adolf Hitler. So again, not saying that Alabama is Nazi Germany, but there are some connections that have to be made. And that we have to understand that when we're designing, figuring out how to do that which is totally unnecessary to execute prisoners, and it becomes such a attention demanding moment that we all have to speak up. But in particular, I believe, as a Jewish person, as a co-founder with Cantor, Mike Zoosman, who unfortunately can't be with us this morning, L'chaim, Jews Against the Death Penalty, stands firmly against all executions, but in particular, the idea of a gas chamber, the idea of smothering a prisoner with gas. So I want to make sure also that we state very clearly that we remember the victims, but we don't think we need to do it with more killing. And we also believe that no amount of killing is going to bring back our loved ones. And as we do in the vast majority of cases,
this meeting is being recorded.
As we do in the vast majority of cases, we can be safe from people who've done awful crimes and hold them accountable without executions. Now, why are we here in this moment? We're here in this moment because in the summer of 2022, we had an execution that went horribly wrong. Joe James Jr. was put on the gurney and jabbed and stabbed and sliced for several hours while the media waited outside. And when the media came in and they opened up the curtains, he was already unconscious. And we know that Joe James Jr. had a last statement prepared. We know that he was ready to make a statement. And we know that they were afraid that he was going to come out and say, they've just been torturing me for hours, which is not what the death penalty is supposed to be in this country. And then the very next two executions in September, Alan Miller, and in November, Kenneth Smith, who were set to do this truly again in a month. Two more times the state of Alabama failed. Not just botched executions, they failed executions, sending these prisoners back to death row, back to their cells, after being jabbed and sliced in an attempt to get an execution going. So in addition to the petition that we have about the gas chamber, we've also been working with our allies throughout Alabama to lift up this idea of our Pull Back the Curtains campaign, where we want to make sure that the media and anybody else that's responsible for witnessing on behalf of the public is seeing the entire process from the time that they open the curtains, or actually from the time the prisoner is brought into the death chamber, whether they do it on their own 2 feet, or as happened 5 times in 2022, rolled in their wheelchair across this country 5 times. We're executing people in wheelchairs. That should be witnessed the whole time. So you got a link to that in the chat too, the petition to pull back the curtains, the petition about stopping the gas chamber, and also, of course, a petition for Kenneth Smith, because in Kenneth Smith's case, if he was facing execution today in court, they would not even be seeking the death penalty because of the situations in his case. That's all outlined in the petitions. So I wanted to make sure that we're clear about that. I want to thank you for attending. And now I'd like to introduce Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood. Please turn on your screen, Jeff. And Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, spiritual advisor to Kenneth Smith and a member of the Advisory Committee of Death Penalty Action.
Thank you, Abe. It's heavy, obviously. I mean, we're not just talking about someone who is, this sort of abstract reality, so this abstract person. Kenneth Smith is a friend of mine, and he's somebody that I've grown very close to, someone that I've come to love. And, I think it's important to first and foremost point out that we're talking about a human being. We're talking about someone who is a father. We're talking about someone who is a husband. We're talking about someone who, for that matter, is a grandfather. And we're also talking about somebody that has been through hell. He has, he compared what he went through in the botched execution to being under a sewing machine. And so, when Kenny and I first connected, I came to engage Kenny as someone who, has experienced unbelievable trauma. And it seems to me that alone should be enough for us not to continue on trying to kill him. But since that is not the case, I think it's important that we speak to what is happening presently. Make no mistake, I am opposed to the death penalty. There is no question about that, and there shouldn't be. But at the same time, I also am aware that we live in a nation of laws. The state of Alabama is not above the law. We might not be able to stop this execution as activists. We might not be able to hold back the tide of this impending execution. But we can demand that if it happens, if heaven forbid it happens, that the state of Alabama follow the law. The Supreme Court does not issue suggestions. It issues rulings. And in recent years, it has ruled that a spiritual advisor can be present in the chamber during the execution. By ruling that the spiritual advisor can be in the chamber during the execution, it has also granted certain rights to the spiritual advisor. And what I mean by that is I carry my First Amendment rights with me into the chamber. When Kenny asked me to be his spiritual advisor, he asked me, "Are you willing to die to do this?" You know, it's a heavy thing to talk to your wife. I have 5 children, twins that are 11, a 10-year-old, and twins that are 8. And to have to talk to them to say, you know, here is someone who has asked me to stand with him in his hour of death. And this is what I do. This is what I feel called by God to do. I think that the message of Jesus is very clear. What you have done to the least of these, you have done to me. We are called to be in these spaces. And so I felt like I couldn't say no. And then I was presented with this waiver from the state of Alabama. And this waiver, you know, it's online now, and if anybody wants a copy or whatever, wants a link, we can get that to you. But basically, this waiver very clearly states that there is a risk. Now, I think that the argument is going to be, how big is the risk? But I can tell you that you don't give out a waiver if there's not a risk. And so when I, look at this waiver, it talks about nitrogen. It gives all of these sort of, broad statements about what what nitrogen is, what a nitrogen execution looks like. But of course, the problem is that they're telling me what nitrogen is and what a nitrogen execution looks like, and they don't know what a nitrogen execution looks like because the protocol is consistently being revised. So they're asking me to sign a waiver for something that they themselves don't even have figured out yet completely. I mean, they're still in court. They're still engaging and arguing over this protocol. It also said that I was required to remain 3 feet back from Kenny. Well, such a statement in and of itself, depending on how you state the 3 feet back, whether it's from Kenny, whether it's from the mechanism, whether it's from the mask, whether it's from the nitrogen apparatus system, there are all sorts of words that they have used. But the problem with that is that 3 feet, I mean, you're not talking about a very large space. You're talking about a space where 3 feet from all of these different pieces could put you in a very small area. So the question thus becomes, by signing this waiver or engaging this waiver under duress, I might add, I only had a number of days to figure out whether or not I was going to sign this waiver. Of course, if given the opportunity to be there with someone that you love, someone that you care about, any of us are going to sign a waiver like that. I mean, this is what I do. Of course, I sign the waiver. But it feels like a kind of a bait and switch type situation. It feels like I had to sign this waiver, and then all of a sudden I'm looking at the 3 feet, and they begin to sort of be able to change or to define what this 3 feet looks like themselves. One of the statements that I've consistently used to describe this process is that it is a tyranny of vagueness. The state of Alabama is getting to do whatever it wants to with regards to my presence in the chamber by simply not clearly stating what is going on. It is, it's not just problematic, it's dangerous. It's dangerous certainly it's dangerous for Kenny's religious liberty, it's dangerous for my religious liberty, and as far as I'm concerned, it's dangerous for religious liberty for ministers and other persons all over the state. Because when the state thinks that they can start regulating where people can practice their ministry, then the question becomes, who else's ministry are they going to regulate? So I think as far as the lawsuit is concerned, I think the two big components for us is, one, is this a safe space? The problem with vagueness is there's no way to tell right now. There's no way to define what is safety in this space right now. So I want you to think about this. If a nitrogen leak were to happen in the execution chamber, who will be there? What is the emergency procedure if I collapse, am sitting there on the floor? What's the procedure for getting me out of the chamber? You asked me to sign a waiver saying that this is dangerous, that it's even possibly lethal, and then you don't give any sort of explanation about what happens in the event of an emergency. Nor has the state given any sort of details about how many people have died of nitrogen exposure in the past few decades. They simply said, oh, this is safe, trust us. Well, trust is a very weird thing to talk about when you're talking about Alabama and executions. Less than a month ago with Casey McWhorter, I had the opportunity to see how the Alabama Department of Corrections carries out executions. I was able to see the entire process from being in the chamber to, touching Casey not long before he passed, was executed. And I want to make something very clear. Alabama is operating. So I guess another point I need to quickly make is Casey's was the fourth execution that I have been present for in the United States this year. Scott Eisenberg in January was the first, and Arthur Brown in March in Texas was the second. Anthony Sanchez in Oklahoma was the third, and the fourth, of course, being Casey McWhorter. I can tell you, and I want to make sure this is clear, Alabama is the most unprofessional, loose, like crazy process that I have seen. I've made it very clear I oppose the death penalty. But if someone is going to be put to death, what we're talking about is nobody wants to see a botched execution. Nobody wants to see a looseness. Nobody wants to see all of these sorts of problems and lack of professionalism. In Texas and Oklahoma, you very clearly know what's going to happen. There is very clear roles. Everything is very defined. In Alabama, it feels like they are making it up as they go. And these are the people who are supposed to carry out the first nitrogen hypoxia execution in the United States. I told my wife yesterday that thinking that these folks, having seen them in action, thinking that these folks are capable of carrying out a nitrogen hypoxia execution is like asking the middle school football team in Tuscaloosa to play the University of Alabama and beat them by 14 or 21 points. It's absurd. It is absolutely absurd. So forgive me if I'm a little skeptical about their ability to keep me safe, which is one of the reasons, of course, why we filed this lawsuit. And I'll also say, forgive me if I'm a little bit skeptical of the way that they value religious liberty. Lastly, I'll say this. The state of Alabama consistently talks about religious liberty. They consistently talk about how this is a fundamental value for the state. Well, the question that I have is, if this is something that is so valuable, then why hasn't it been defined in the protocol how they are going to protect religious liberty in a nitrogen hypoxia execution? It is clear to me that they haven't thought about it. They haven't defined it. And it's also clear to me that we didn't have a choice except to pursue legal action in order to make them define it, make them define what religious liberty is going to look like in this space. How are they going to follow Supreme Court precedents, which says that I am able to get closer than 3 feet to Kenneth Smith? This lawsuit, again, demands more from the state of Alabama than vagueness and assumptions and demands of trust that hasn't been earned. It's my hope that this lawsuit leads to a very clear understanding of these things, and that when I walk into that execution chamber, I am clear as to what I'm walking into. When I participate in these sacred spiritual moments there in the execution chamber, I want to know for sure that I'm not going to be asked to step back, that I'm not waving away my rights or Kenny's rights. So I'm very thankful to my lawyers, Eric Allen and Greg Gardner. I think it's important to point out that my legal team is completely separate from Kenny's legal team. We are pursuing this on my behalf, and of course there's a benefit to Kenny along the way, but we think it is incredibly important that a precedent is set in Alabama that when you try these untested methods of execution, that religious liberty ministers in the execution chamber are going to be protected and religious liberty is going to be protected. Wanted to also say thank you to Abe and Death Penalty Action for hosting us today.
Thank you. And we'll invite Esther Brown now to join us to give a brief statement from Project Hope to abolish the death penalty. Esther? You can turn on your video, please.
I think you have to. I think you have to do it because it won't allow me.
Okay, try it.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you to all who made this possible. And I think the Reverend Jeff Hood has very well stated our concerns, and I speak for the men on death row, because Project Hope to abolish the death penalty is a death row organization. I'm the outsider. And we are concerned for the safety of Reverend Jeff Hood, and also I thought we were a very religious state. Apparently not. I want to briefly talk about Kenny, who was very traumatized from the attempted and botched execution. He suffers from PTSD, incredible headaches. He's changed. He's not himself anymore. I also spoke with his wife yesterday, and I don't think, unless you've been part of it, that you can really imagine. This is torture that he was put through. Torture. He wasn't sentenced to torture, but that's what the state of Alabama did. And now all over again, and we really have no idea how this is going to work, because as the Reverend Jeff Hood said, the state really doesn't know. First, it guards everything so one can't see anything of how it will happen. Then it lets out a little bit of something, but obviously it doesn't know what it's doing. And as I always, I totally agree with Reverend Hood also about the inefficiency. And I would just like to say what I was told when I first came to this state: Alabama first in everything bad and last in everything good. And this is certainly it. And I just ask this state that calls itself Christian, what are you doing? What are you doing? And always my rights and all of that. Where are the rights? Where are the rights of both the spiritual advisor to be able to minister and to anoint and put his hands on the victim to be executed? I'm sorry, I'm on the other side. I'm not calling him a victim. And where are the rights of the individual? I don't understand it. But obviously, we're very, very grateful that this is making the headlines all over the world. Alabama lost in everything good. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. We will now take questions from members of the media. You can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand and we'll call on you. We can use the Q&A, however it works. And you, Jeff, there's a question. Can you elaborate on why it's so important that you be able to stand close to and touch Mr. Smith during his execution?
Thank you, Catherine. I think it's important to point out that, when people, obviously this is a question that I've thought about. When people say, why is this important? I kind of, flip it around and say, well, why is it important for your minister to touch you when you are baptized? Why is it important for your minister to serve you communion? Why is it important for your minister to be able to touch you at your time of death? I mean, the Supreme Court has said that religious liberty in these moments is sacred. And the Supreme Court has said in the Ramirez decision out of Texas that it was that Dana Moore, Ramirez's pastor, could place his hands on Ramirez during the execution. So we have precedents. But I think if you want to get to a spiritual place, I think that Kenny comes from a tradition in which laying of hands is a means by which a deeply spiritual moment happens. I don't think that it's our place to question the value of certain religious exercises. I think it is our place as a free society to protect them.
Jeff, there's a question from Emily Mosner at WHNT News 19. Can you please expand on when you signed the waiver? You mentioned being rushed. What was the situation?
Thank you, Emily. So I signed the waiver. Kenny gave me the waiver, and I signed it. What ends up happening is, and this is true around the state, but they, Abe, could you spotlight this video? But I was just going to say that what ends up happening is when a death sentence is handed down, you have 5 days to, the inmate has 5 days to decide on, let me rephrase. When a date is given, the inmate has 5 days to choose their spiritual advisor to respond. Well, during those 5 days, depending on how long the inmate takes, there is more or less time for the spiritual advisor to think about this. I don't know about most people, because most people don't have to sign a waiver like this. But 5 days feels like a kind of a short time to be able to talk to your family and think about what is, the whole world and realm of possibilities that could happen. Truth be told, I signed the waiver knowing that if I didn't sign the waiver, I wasn't going to be able to be there for Kenny. And that's why it mattered to me. I think it's important that I state that as when Kenny asked me, "Are you willing to die to be my spiritual advisor?" my answer was yes. And I hope that in my ministry, my answer will always be yes. But that is a big thing to ask of someone. And that's a big thing to ask of someone when you only have a couple of days to ruminate on it, to talk to your family, and for that matter, to take it even a step further, to have the time to talk to experts about it. I didn't have any time to seek out any sort of expertise about what I was walking into. I was just asked to sign a waiver.
Jeff, we have a number of other questions. Abby Brooks from NBC News asks, there was a lot of confusion among the incarcerated men at Holman Prison about the process of submitting waivers, electing nitrogen as an execution process. Was there any confusion, or mismanagement of the waiver process for you? And she has a follow-up question as well.
Yeah, Abby, I think that it's important to point out that um, I got this waiver in the midst of the process to execute Casey McWhorter. So I want you to imagine this. I'm sitting there ministering to Casey in his final moments. He's sitting there, tears in his eyes, telling his mother goodbye, and I have not long before that been given this waiver. I tried to do what I could to sign the waiver, tried to give it to the secretary there, Miss Parker at Holman Correctional Facility. She would not accept the waiver because she said that she doesn't accept any paperwork on the days of executions. So in order to get them the paperwork, I had to get some help from the Federal Defender's Office in Montgomery to even get this paperwork turned in. So, I mean, to say that this place down there is mismanaged is an understatement. You can't even turn in paperwork that they give you to sign. And there's also this piece that I asked for another instance of paperwork that needed to be done. And they said they didn't have the paperwork. Again, this is a very, very confusing and mismanaged process. And it begins with the fact that Holman Correctional Facility is a very confusing and mismanaged place.
Ms. Brooks has another question, and then we've got one from Megan Plotka and AA and Catherine Post. So Ms. Brooks' follow-up question is, have you heard any?
I think we missed Eric Ortiz at the top.
Okay, I will check back on that. Here is the follow-up from Abigail Brooks. Have you heard anything additional from the state about safety protocols for you or corrections officers in the room if something goes wrong? I think you've already addressed a little bit of that, but that's the question.
Yeah, just to quickly, Abby, I guess, add to my response. Again, I want everybody that is listening, that is on this press conference, to consider, when you don't know what's going to happen, who's going to come get you if something happens. If you fall out in this room, we are in an enclosed room. Nitrogen is odorless. You can't see it, can't swat at it. They say, okay, well, we're going to have these oxygen sensors. Well, how am I to know whether these oxygen sensors even work, or what they do, or what they look like? There's been no training. There's been no talk of training. And so, again, as far as safety protocols go, as far as I am concerned, I have been given no safety protocols for myself. Now, there certainly is the protocol, and there's been, court cases and arguments going about that. But as far as any sort of training or safety protocol, safety training, none of that has happened at all.
We have a question from Krishna Vyas in a moment, but first we have, I think you've already begun to address this also. Megan Plotka asks, can you expand on the possible health impact of the nitrogen hypoxia for you?
Sure. I mean, nitrogen is a lethal gas. There have been dozens and dozens of recorded workplace accidents, deaths based on exposure to nitrogen. So I think that it's important to say that it's not just a health impact. I mean, the risk is death. I mean, I've had to deal with the very real reality that the state of Alabama could kill me while I am trying to minister to Kenneth Smith. And so I think that it's important to make it very plain.
So AA asks, can you explain what you witnessed that resulted in your perception that Alabama is the most unprofessional and has a crazy process for executions compared to the other executions that you have been present for and witnessed?
Sure. you know, I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, I could go on all day about this. The first thing that comes to mind, if anybody isn't aware, Holman Penitentiary has a large cat population. When you go into the prison and walk down the hallways, there are cats walking in and out of various spaces. I mean, it is bizarre. A large part of the prison is not functioning because they're not health-wise able to put anyone in there. Throughout the day, the guards acted in an almost festive way at the execution of Casey McWhorter. What I saw was people cutting up, slapping each other's backs, laughing, on and on and on. I go to the waiting room, perhaps one of the most solemn moments of the entire process, sitting there with Casey McWhorter, talking, praying, reading scripture. And right across from the cell, all of the execution squad is sitting there watching ESPN as loud as possible, to the point where I was having difficulty talking to Casey. While I'm in the execution chamber itself, I could still hear ESPN in the next room over. I could hear the fact this was when Jim Harbaugh got accepted the 3-game suspension at the University of Michigan, their football coach. I could hear what was happening. I could hear, every detail. And, in other states, I mean, there never was any sort of actual sit-down conversation. Do you have any questions? Here are the authorities. Here are people from the Department of Corrections. I was never introduced or oriented with anybody except a guard and the warden. And, no sort of safety precautions, no sort of protocols, processes, or whatever. It felt like they were making it up as we went along. With Oklahoma and Texas, you have processes that what is going to happen every single moment along the way. They have it mapped out. You know where you're going to go. I had somebody with me the whole time, helping me go different places, telling me, okay, this door, that door. I had meetings with multiple officials from both departments of corrections. There was a fundamental understanding about what was going to happen. When I was in the chamber in Alabama, there was confusion as to when I could pray out loud. And the reason that there was confusion is because they didn't mention it. They forgot. Again, I talked about the paperwork earlier, not wanting to take the paperwork being a problem. I could go on and on, but the point is that in other states, they're not botching executions like Alabama has. We're not seeing 3 botched executions in a row. With Casey, there were medical professionals who kept asking him where his veins were, which led me to be terrified for him that I was going to be, in there for another botched execution. Again, these questions shouldn't be ruminating before an execution. It should be very clear what is going to happen. And in Texas and Oklahoma, it is. In Alabama, it is not.
Jeff, we have a number of other questions. Here's one from Catherine Post, and I also see the questions from Krishma Vyas and Maddie Temple and Alyssa Spady from CBS. And if Eric Ortiz has a question, he might have sent that to you separately. So I would ask that he send that in the chat or the Q&A. But Catherine Post asks, are you able to share more about Mr. Smith's faith? Where is he turning to for solace during this time?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Catherine. Kenny is a follower of Jesus. He is somebody that has a deep love for God, that is a man of deep prayer. And so as we talk once a day, sometimes twice a day. we find ourselves journeying into the deep questions, the existential questions, and I think that those spaces of questions are most often where we find God. And so, I think that there's no doubt in my mind that he is drawing solace from God, from his faith in Jesus, but also even further than that, from his family and from me, from those who are around him. He's kept a very tight circle around him through all of this, and it is my firm belief that we are going to hold him up, and we're going to make sure he doesn't fall.
Yeah, the next question is from Krishma Vyas. Do you have any expectation that this execution will be commuted to an extended prison sentence? Is that even a possibility under Alabama law?
Well, I could go into detail about this, but I think from what we're seeing right now, the state of Alabama seems determined to kill Kenny Smith. And so, we can pray and we can work, but right now the state is certainly very determined to make this happen.
Thank you. Maddie Temple asks, have you asked the Alabama Department of Corrections what they would do if something happens to you or a correction officer in the room? What did they say, if so?
They don't know. I mean, they fundamentally, don't know. I mean, when you ask them these types of questions, they don't know. And I think that is the most frightening thing about this whole thing is there are just pieces of this that they don't know or haven't answered. Again, I think it's that phrase once again, that this whole process has been a tyranny of vagueness, that they don't know.
All right.
Or perhaps maybe they won't say, but it seems to me like they don't know.
Okay. Lisa Spady asks from CBS News, have you received a non-redacted version of the rules of the nitrogen hypoxia execution protocol?
No, not at all. And, obviously that's unbelievably problematic to ask someone to sign a waiver to be a part of something, to go into a space, and you don't even know what you're walking into.
Okay. Let's see. Eric Ortiz asks, what are the next steps for the lawsuit?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So the state will get a chance to respond to the lawsuit. My suspicion is that they will try to get it thrown out, which is true of about every lawsuit. I think it's important to point out that the things that we are asking the state of Alabama to do are not impossible things to do. I mean, I think that it's important to point out that if they want this execution to go forward, there are changes that they could easily make. But what is most frightening about this moment is the reason they don't seem to be making such changes is because they want to do it their way, and they want to do it as cheaply as possible. And, when someone wants to do it their way as cheaply, and for that matter, as secretively as possible, obviously, that's terrifying. And so, yeah, I mean, the next steps are to, again, demand change. But, I want to make sure, Eric, that, I very clearly point out that if this lawsuit delays or stops Kenny's execution, it will be nobody's fault except the state of Alabama's fault. All the state of Alabama has to do is to ensure the safety of the people in the chamber and ensure that they are going to follow Supreme Court precedents as far as religious liberty is concerned. Again, if this execution is delayed or stopped, they will have nobody to blame. The state of Alabama will have no one to blame except themselves.
Thank you, Jeff. Allie, do you see any other questions that I may have missed?
Yeah, there's one more question I think we missed. Somebody was asking, hold on, let me find it. Who has the last word, whether this goes ahead?
I think I think that there's a number of last words, but obviously the governor has a final say in the governor has a final say in the final days, final moments. The Supreme Court has a final say in the final days and the final moments, and I think it's those two groups of, those two bodies, the governor's office and the Supreme Court, that have the most authority in that moment. But there's also, obviously with Kenny and Alan Miller, we saw that somebody down at Holman has the authority to stop the execution if it don't work, if it's botched. So, that's a very interesting thing that I don't think anybody really knows who that authority belongs to. Who makes that call?
I would add that the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't seem to be very much concerned at all about legal matters. And that's why one of the reasons we're all going to be very interested to see what happens in this case, because really the only thing that seems to be stopping executions from the current United States Supreme Court is the questions of religious liberty. One of the attorneys on this lawsuit, Eric Allen, was also the attorney for John Ramirez in Texas, who had other questions, but and so there was a similar case here in Alabama as well. Questions about your mental illness or your mental acuity, or whether you have evidence of innocence, or whether you have evidence of racism tinging your conviction. We've seen these questions in other cases all year long, and none of them have stopped it. But what stopped the John Ramirez execution for a year was the question of whether his pastor could be in the death chamber with him, laying hands on him, praying out loud. And that actually that case actually required Texas, in order to move forward with the executions, to change its execution protocol, which is pretty amazing if you can think about it. That's all that the Supreme Court seems to be concerned about. Are we having our Christian pastor able to pray out loud in the death chamber, laying hands on? Otherwise, all other issues seem to be moot. And it doesn't matter how good your attorneys are. And we see the best attorneys in the world working on some of these cases, and they end up being denied at the U.S. Supreme Court. So that is a question. Are there any other questions?
Abe, I wanted to quickly jump in and say one more thing. And I want to make sure that everybody that is gathered here listens to this, thinks about this very quickly. One of the things that happens in every other state, particularly Texas and Oklahoma, is at the time of death, when they believe that the person has been executed, is dead, a doctor comes out and checks the vital signs and declares the person dead and declares a time of death. And they do that in front of the media. They do that in front of everyone. In Alabama, the media, the people in the chamber never see the doctor come in and declare a time of death and, check the vital signs and declare a time of death. Well, what that means is that nobody can actually state that the person is actually dead. So we have seen people pass out. We have seen cold water drownings. We have seen people who are in situations where they have a very slight pulse. There's all sorts of situations where someone could visually appear dead, but not be. I am very concerned that with this nitrogen hypoxia execution, that the state has so much riding on this moment that even if Kenny wasn't dead, that the state of Alabama could finish the task and nobody would ever know, because the media and the people in the chamber don't get to see the doctor pronounce death and a time of death. So I think that one of the things that needs to happen, has to happen in Alabama for this process to be transparent, is for the doctor to actually come out and declare a time of death after checking the vital signs in front of the gathered witnesses and the gathered media. They make the argument, I'll say this, they make the argument that that puts that doctor at risk. My response to that is, well, you know, I've seen in other states where a doctor will wear a hood or something to keep their identity secret. But I think that there's a variety of opinions about that. But the point is that even if they have to hide their identity, it is so important that we see a doctor come out, check the vital signs, and declare a time of death. Because if we don't, then we cannot be sure of what the time of death actually is and what actually killed the person.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to make a last call for questions, and also note that there was a question about one of the other ways that this might stop is if they run out of time. And one of the outcomes of these two times in the case of Kenny Smith and the case of Alan Miller in 2022, when they ran out of time. And that's the only reason that Kenny Smith is still alive, is because they ran out of time. Alabama investigated it itself, had its own Department of Corrections investigate its own process, not any outside investigators, not even a different agency. And basically the only real shift that they made was they extended the window. So now the window for an execution to be carried out is 30 hours. And so that should be plenty of time, you would think. It sounds a little macabre, but, death penalty action, I personally have been protesting execution since around the 400th execution, and we're now approaching the 1200th execution. I'm sorry, we're now approaching the 1600th execution, so over 1100 executions. Different states have different protocols and do things with different levels of efficiency, if that's a fair word. But when we go to Texas, we know it's going to be done in an hour. When we go to Oklahoma, often it's going to be done in an hour. Missouri, Florida, they have it together. In Alabama, we do these live virtual vigils, and you're all invited, if this happens, to be on with us online as we, stand witness with the folks on the ground in the state and bring together people from around the country. But the longest vigils we've ever had are the ones from Alabama. Kenny Smith, we were on from 5 o'clock Central Time until after 11 p.m. It's a long, long time, and you can't have a protest in view of the prison in Alabama, whereas in Texas and in Florida and in Oklahoma, you can be right outside, you can see the prison. It's another one of the things that they do. Well, we had to sue the federal government, or the Indiana State Police, I should say, in order to have access to be right in front of the prison when they were doing a federal execution spree during the last 6 months of the Trump administration. They quickly backed down once that lawsuit went. But, we recognize that we're not the lawyers here. We're not the people that can address this through the law, but we are here to shine a spotlight on these executions and let people know. One of the things that happens is every time one of these cases comes up, there's always an issue of concern in these cases. And every time more people join our movement because they come to understand that government can't be trusted with the power to kill. That's the bottom line. There's so much more that we could say. See, we have Jeff has put his his contact information in the chat. And of course, he's available through the information on the press release. Blair Fitzgibbon is here in the audience, and he is our publicist, and you can reach out to him to reach me and Jeff, and we can hook you up with others. You know, the next execution in the United States, the world is watching, and it's because it's in Alabama and because it's the gas chamber. And that, again, I want to reiterate, that's why we're inviting people to sign the petitions, which you can find on the webpage at deathpenaltyaction.org. And, you know, right there at the top is the petition for Kenny Smith. Also a petition for the guy that's scheduled right after him in Oklahoma. Here's our efforts on the federal government. And then, you know, our featured campaigns right now are the Alabama campaigns, Say No to the Gas Chamber, and also Pull Back the Curtains on executions in Alabama. Do we see any more questions? Nope. Thank you all very much.